Good afternoon. I apologise for reading my paper, but I have a propensity to wander, and 20 minutes will suddenly become 19 minutes on the first slide, and then trying to get it all in at the last moment. The manufacture and sale of bread was regulated in medieval England from at least the middle of the 13th century by the assise of bread and ale. This legislation proves a rich source of information for the historical study of this most staple of foodstuffs. But what about those of us with a much more practical viewpoint of history? Is it possible to recreate accurately a loaf of medieval bread? How was it made, and can we approach the methodology of reconstruction in a more accurate manner than has been done before? The assise of bread has been written about at great length by many authors, notably Ross, Davis, Nicholas and Thrupp, but their excellent and scholarly work is based on the socio-economic impact of the legislation rather than the actual bread itself. Works considering bread as foodstuffs are in the main relegated to the more populist histories, food and social histories, local television programmes, documentaries and such like. And here the subject tends to be paid scant regard, as it has to fit in to publications considering all foods within a 500 or 600 year period. So it gets a very small nod. According to most of these food histories, the manufacture of bread was a simple task. Rich ate fine white flour, and the poor used a coarse wholemeal, almost straight from the mill. To make a loaf, you simply add water and yeast to your chosen flour, pop in the oven, and bake until it's done. It's my contention, however, this is a far oversimplified system, and that the manufacturing process was considerably more complicated than many have implied. I suggest that it is the methodology of making the bread which is far more important to obtaining an accurate reconstruction than the actual flour used for that purpose. It is through experimentation that we can achieve a much closer approximation to the sorts of bread our forebears would recognise. The assise of bread defined the different bread types available for purchase in medieval England. Its purpose was to ensure the availability of constant and reasonably priced bread so that loaves were always available for sale in towns and villages, and to ensure that bread was not priced out of availability due to price fluctuations of grain or the actions of unscrupulous bakers. The assise set the price of wheaten loaves to be 1 penny, 1 halfpenny or 1 farthing in cost, but the weight of those loaves was to vary depending on the overall price of grain and the quality of the finished product. This information was set forth as a series of rather tedious prices that 1/4 of a wheat could sell for, and respective of those prices, the weight that a farthing loaf of a specific quality called wastel must be. Calculations were then provided in order to ascertain the weights of the other qualities of loaf for those given wheat costs in relation to the wastel bread. The assise was a national statute, although regional variations do seem to exist, mainly in the loaves named and sold in different areas. The national assise mentions wastel, simnel, cocket, both great and small, treat, common wheat and whole wheat. Bakers in Southampton had all of those, along with a bread called Ranger. They also had French bread, which is colloquially called puff at the time. Don't know why, unfortunately. And bread of whole wheat. And those in Bristol substitute cribratus and mixitillus in place of Ranger and whole wheat. We can infer from the placement of the names of the loaves within the assise text which loaves were considered superior to which, gain a rough idea of their quality, and discern clues as to the differences in manufacturing techniques for the different breads. For the purpose of reconstruction, my aim was to recreate a loaf of Cribble bread, because in Thomas Eliot's dictionary of 1538, under the definition of bread, he defines panis secundarius as ranged bread, or cheat bread, or Cribble bread. This equates Cribble bread with cheat bread, one of the principal loaves served at the court of Henry VIII, and thus a convenient link to my employment with historic royal palaces, and a justified reason for spending far, far too much of my employer's time and money on sieving flour. Ranged bread, or Ranger as it was known in Southampton, derives its name from the Ranger, the local name for a sieve. Cribble bread, or the name Cribble, derives from the Latin cribratus, again for sieve. So from that we can infer that the sieve, or sieving itself, is an important part of the manufacture of those loaves of bread. In sieving or bolting the flour after the grinding, a quantity of whole grain flour was passed by the miller through a coarse sieve to extract bran on the left there in my series of tiny Weetabixes. That bran wasn't used for human consumption. It then went on to make horse bread or dog bread. The bran and the remains of the meal, less a fee or toll, were then passed on to the baker, who continued the sieving process. That which had passed through the first sieve was then passed through a second, medium grate, to extract the fraction called treat. And finally, everything that passed through the second sieve was then passed through a finest to remove the last extraction, which they called cribble, leaving finest flour. I believe that this sieving is key to a more accurate attempt at reconstruction, and that the fractions of treat and cribble removed from the whole flour were the meal used to manufacture those respective loaves, rather than the flour that passed through the sieves, which, with the finest flour, went on to make the cocket and wastel breads. To my mind, experimentation seems to be the best or only way, really, to determine if it is at all possible to make a loaf of bread out of cribble or treat. The assise gives us no information as to the finest that the wheat would be ground to, and as yet I have discovered no absolute definition for the grades of sieves that would be used, only that the whole grain was passed through 3 processes, presumably considered coarse, medium and fine relative to one another. The best surviving evidence for the multi-part process of this is this instruction from the directions given to bakers in London during the reign of Richard II, where they were told that first every baker swear to charge his servants to sieve their meal twice, that is to say with a large sieve and a smaller one. But do we have any evidence for the sieves themselves? Illustrations of sieves are, frankly, very little help. They're designed to show the viewer that the item in question is a sieve, not to be accurate representations of a practical tool, as if we were to reconstruct a sieve based on any of these pictures, it wouldn't sieve out much material at all. Written descriptions, such as this 14th century definition of a sieve, which tells us a cribrum is a sieve, round with many holes, prove to be equally as useless at times. Other text sources can be a little more helpful. They tell us that sieves or bolters were made of a cloth, as is quite clear from the description given in the York Civic Ordinances of 1301, which tell us that each baker shall have his own sign for marking his bread and a bolting cloth, as is proper for wastel, simnel, demesne bread and cocket bread. Further searching shows us that some of these sieves and linen sieves were made from linen, The description from the Ipswich Doomsday of 1436 tells us that it is ordained that no baxter of the foresaid town make no wastel, simnel, nor the first cocket, but if it be a boltel of rains, nor the second cocket, unless it is a boltel of bucca. This references 2 grades of sieving material, one made from cloth of rains, a fine grade of linen produced in reams, although quite how fine is yet unknown. This was used to sieve out and produce the best quality breads, and a second as yet unknown cloth called bucca used for the next grade down in that city. For the purposes of the experimental work though, I needed 3 sieves, and for all sieves I've chosen to use a modern stainless steel mesh in order to eliminate manufacturing inconsistencies found in cloth and to aid consistent repeatability. The meshes are measured in US mesh scale, as that equates quite nicely to threads per inch. Choosing sieves that compare with a linen cloth because of the Ipswich quote, medieval linen was sought for comparison. Surviving fragments from London, although very rare, give us a maximum thread count of around 56 threads per inch, which led me to choose a 60 mesh sieve as my prospective finest grade to simulate cloth of rains. To answer questions posed by colleagues who regarded silk sieves as a possible substitute for the highest quality, I selected an 80 mesh sample for that, and to answer questions regarding a more modern flour production, 120 mesh was also procured, as well as a silk fabric sample of approximately 75 threads per inch, all of which accord quite well with surviving silk fragments from medieval London. With 60 mesh set as the prospective upper end of the scales, 40, 30 and 20 mesh were secured simply because they were the most readily available in terms of stainless steel mesh production. I had to set, though, a level, where to start. What was the definition of coarse? Fortunately, in the Liber Niger Domus Regis Edward IV, which instructions for the household, or the royal household, the bakehouse had instructions that the officer was expected to extract from every quarter of wheat 2 bushels of bran, or 25%. So, passing the flour that I had through a sieve, should any select 25% as bran, that would be my chosen coarse sieve to use and give me a baseline to start working from. The missing piece of the puzzle, though, is the flour itself, with no details to the fineness that it would have come from the mill, and like the regional nature of the sieve grades, it's something with many, many determining factors and no set national definition. I chose 6 stone ground flours produced by different manufacturers, all of differing levels of coarseness. These were passed in 100-gram samples through each of the sieves. This process was repeated 5 times for each sieve, and an average obtained for the total weight of materials extracted. Should any of those extract the 25% of the flour, then that sieve would be set as the coarsest, and that respective flour used as my flour for future testing. 20 mesh material was far too coarse to filter out the required level of bran, with the results ranging from 2% retained to 16% at a maximum. At the other end of the scale, it was very clear that the 120 mesh was far, far too fine. Simply put, nothing went through the sieve without me spending an age trying to pass it through. I first thought that the clogging might have been due to the hygroscopic nature of flour and the exceptionally moist conditions of the kitchens at Hampton Court Palace where this was being done. However, keeping the flour in a drying environment and working in a warm room, much like we heard from our poster presentation on the Roman ceramic earlier, my mother's kitchen, still resulted in the same clogging. I now suspect it's now due to the bran oil content of the flour rather than the moisture content absorbed from the atmosphere, as both the 60 and 80 mesh sieves from many of the flour samples clogged in the same way. More modern methods of extraction, concerned only with obtaining the largest volume of fine flour, can use high-density meshes simply because they are only interested in procuring the largest quantity of fine flour, and it is forced physically through the sieve. Medieval bakers were not in a position to do this, as both the material retained in the sieve and the flour that passed through it were equally valued. Common sense would dictate, as I was told many, many times, that a stack of sieves could be made with the whole flour placed in the top, the stack with flour included placed on a vibrating platform, the button pressed, and me to sit back with a cup of tea and wait for it all to be sieved, which I must admit was my aim when I first started the sieving process some year ago. Unfortunately, this is not a feasible proposition because the components of the whole flour are friable in their nature. Left on a vibrating plate in such a stack, all parts eventually break down and pass through all of the sieves. One also has to consider at which point all of the material has been separated by the sieve, and when in a stack it's not possible to see inside to determine that case. Again, with a geological sample, that's a relatively easy prospect to denote. Sieving is complete when everything stops falling through. However, with flour, the particles continue to fall through as the different sizes break down, and until you end up with everything that started in the top of the stack being in the very, very bottom. There must be a point at which you consider each separation to be complete, and there must be a way in which you can ascertain that. I have used the exceptionally subtle colour change, which you can't see very well in this slide, of the contents in the sieve as an indicator of the job's completion. As the separation nears the end, the contents of the sieve become ever darker, and when the process is finished, no longer exhibit the tide line of light material that you can see around the very top, which can actually be seen more clearly when looking at a 30 mesh sample here. I believe this visual method is the only realistic way medieval bakers would have to determine the completeness of separation of the component parts. And as such, it's highly susceptible to the human nature component of the, hell, that's enough. Testing with 80 mesh showed that this is still too fine as well. 4 of the 6 flours used took up to 40 minutes to process 100-gram samples, leading me to discount the mesh as far too impractical for bulk use. Moving on to the silk and testing with the actual silk fabric at 75 threads per inch confirmed my decision as being prospectively correct, as unlike the finest stainless steel material, as soon as you start to sieve, it clogs almost instantaneously. You have the combination of the high bran oil content and the moisture that's absorbed by the silk, forming an almost impenetrable concrete of dough in the sieve. The only solution to getting the silk to work was to pass very small quantities through it, less than 10-gram samples at a time, and to clear the silk of blockage regularly, which took far too much time and resulted in far too much wastage to be considered practical. Although, as you can see from the colour differentiation with the bottom to top, the final flour produced, if you were after white flour, is of exceptionally high quality. And the small sample I got, that's probably twice the amount that came out of 100 grams, was whiter than a modern bleached processed white flour. With the 20, 80 and 120 mesh sieves discounted, that only left the 30, 40 and 60 meshes to represent coarse, medium and fine. Testing with the 30 mesh sieve coincidentally gave me the 25% extraction rate with 2 of the flours that I'd chosen. Both of those flours and producing very similar results for all 3 sieves, although I did discount one of them due to production supply problems. With sieves and flour chosen, bulk sieving to obtain sufficient ingredients for baking could begin. The chosen grades of sieve, along with the selected flour, should produce extraction rates of approximately 23% bran, 5% treat, 16% cribble, and leaving the remainder as white flour. In order to produce enough cribble to make a 500-gram loaf of bread, as well as to allow sufficient meal for making a sourdough leaven, and have an amount of spare for my inability as a baker, 10.5 kilograms of flour was procured to be passed through the 3 selected sieves. This should result in approximate figures of 2.6 kilograms of bran, 390 grams of treat, and just over 1.1 kilograms of cribble being extracted, with 6.3 kilograms of white flour roughly left at the end. It should allow for the proposed cribble loaf to be baked, as well as a white cocket, a white wastell, and, if time and budget allows from my employer, a bran loaf of horse bread to be manufactured. By now, with my 20 minutes nearly up, it should be blindingly clear that I haven't actually finished this work. And I am, in fact, not able to say, yes, an accurate reconstruction of medieval bread is genuinely possible. Currently, bran and treat extractions have been completed, yielding very close to expected results of 2.7 kilograms of bran compared to 2.6 proposed, and 330 grams of treat, with the disparity being put down to my hell that'll do attitude. Cribble extraction is still ongoing, but has unfortunately been delayed by this work being done in front of visitors to the kitchens at Hampton Court Palace. Our needs to interact with the visitor and to explain and interpret what we do takes precedent over actual completion of the work. It's far common, or more common, for me to present this information over this time scale 3 times an hour than it is to actually do any sieving to our visitors. And as we heard in several papers 2 years ago at the Cardiff conference, experimental work with a public audience is not always conducive to productive experimental work. It's my belief, easy tiger, it's my belief that once completed, this methodology can lead to a more accurate reproduction of a medieval loaf of bread. And it's through experimentation such as this that we gain a better understanding of not just bread, but of food from the past. Thank you.